The way Ghibli approaches water is unmatched, and something I feel like I don't see in many games. After 2 weeks of focusing on nothing else, here's what we have so far. Our water for Maskborne is basic. You can swim around, maybe interact with some NPCs while you're in there, or try to flee for your life as you get chased by enemies much faster than you. Our focus is much more on the visuals, instead of a fully fledged water combat system. So let's break down what makes Ghibli's water so special, and how we got to where we are now. Take this quiet scene where Ponyo and Sasuke are going through town to find his mom. A beautifully rendered background painting, the reflections of the characters go from simplified shapes and colors to just flat color, depending on the lighting. Restraint is what sells the look. And that's what we wanted to create for our game. So the first thing that I wanted to tackle was the actual reflections. This is the static reflection, the painted, rendered background, the thing that doesn't really move, right? Luckily, we already had all of our background elements. They live in a sub-viewport, and that's how we sort of blur the background. That's how we fake our perspective. All of that already lives on the GPU, so we could take that pass and simply reuse it without having to create an extra sub-viewport. Take that, reflect it in the water, and then apply this horizontal blur to it, just to get a little bit of extra blur. And I don't know, maybe naively thought, we'll make the mechanics and we'll make the visuals. But it turned out to be way, way harder than I could have ever imagined. There were so many things, so many different elements to this that I just didn't foresee. I mean, one thing is the gameplay. Right, I think within the first day or two, I had the most basic stuff done. We had a block. Player could swim in it. They're slow. They can't jump out. All that good stuff. But to really sell the look of water, you can't just have reflections, obviously. Water doesn't really have color as such, right? It really depends on what it reflects. But there can be things in water that gives it color. So for this example we have in this level, we have this gradient that we built into the tool. So we did this like acid green gradient we take and we lower the opacity and we layer it on top of the actual water and reflections. It sort of dulls the reflections a little bit and it helps sell the feel of whatever that water is. Now this is something we can dynamically change, like if we wanted it to be blue or red, we could easily achieve that. Another thing that helps us control the look of the water and the reflections, we have our sub-viewports. By default, I think the water reflects back to the sub-viewport -4 or something like that. Like they're all stacked, like this is 0, and then we have -1, -2, -3, and then +1, +2, +3, that kind of stuff. So we can define which range it reflects. Obviously, it won't reflect any +1s because it won't reflect anything in front of the camera, only what's behind it. Or the other way, we knew from the start that we weren't going to be able to solve everything in the shaders, right? Doing everything in a shader with math, it has a certain look to it. It's not a bad look, it's just not the look that we were after, right? This Maskborne is a combination of stuff in shaders and hand-drawn or hand-animated stuff. And we wanted to bring that same level of quality to the water. So we use shaders for what they're good at. Reflections, distortion, ripples, depth in the water, all that good stuff. And then we take hand-drawn animations and we layer those on top. This could be splashes in the water from when the player jumps in, or ripples when they're swimming. So we try to stack those on top as best we can and sort of marry those two very different styles, I suppose. Now the animation for this, just like everything else on the project, runs on 12 FPS. And we settle on that both in terms of like an economic thing, but also look-wise. We tried 24 FPS for some things and it became very smooth, almost too smooth, which is kind of intuitive in a way, seeing as the game runs at, 60 FPS when it's capped. But still, when you have something running at 12 FPS like that, it interpolates what the missing frames, right? So each frame just takes longer. So one frame might be on screen for 3 or 4 frames when it's running at 60 FPS. Now we have a layer that sort of sits between the reflections and the effects, and that's what we call the silhouettes. Now the silhouettes, if you remember back to the Ponyo example, it's just the reflections of the characters. In our case, that would be the player, the enemies, or any kind of foliage that's in our, like the nearest background element. You know, we can reflect that all in the water. We call that our silhouettes. And so the silhouettes from a composition point of view can't interfere too much with the actual gameplay and the player and the enemies. Like they can't take too much focus. And that's one of the things I love about Ghibli's approach to making water and reflections. In Ponyo, like we looked at, they swap between these two types of reflections. One is color and simple shapes, and the other is pure color. I mean, simple shapes still, but like if you're wearing a yellow shirt, the yellow won't reflect in the water. It'll just be like a static color. And so we opted for purely the static route because I think that's going to be easier. And I still think it sells the look very well. And the best way we found to achieve this is the good old duplicate it and flip it in Y. So basically there's just a duplicate of the sprites, of all the sprites that are duplicated or reflected in the water. They just exist twice whenever the water is there. I think it's pretty performant. I mean, the water element in general is pretty performant because we're reusing a lot of the stuff, like I mentioned, that's already on the GPU. There might be better ways, but this is the system that we have now. So as for the characters, like the enemies and player, they're part of what's called a character rig in our system. And all character rigs just get added to a special silhouette group at runtime. But for all our background elements that aren't in a parallax band, all we need to do is we can selectively add what we need to a special group we call water silhouette. And then at runtime, same thing as the other stuff, just gets duplicated, scaled in Y, and then we have reflections. The silhouettes start completely static, right where their reflection sort of meets the water. And then we have a bit of a fall off, 10 pixels, 50 pixels, depending on the size of the entity. And then after that, we introduce distortion. There's both this ripple distortion, but I think more importantly, there are cutouts in the actual silhouette shape. Now, these are just, stamped out of the alpha directly, and it reveals the water color, the water gradient underneath it. And that's done to fake like a highlight, or I guess a highlight, like a wave that swells a little bit and catches the light a little bit differently. I think the combination of those two elements is what Ghibli does really well, and what we've tried to emulate as well. Procedural effects, I feel like, always look procedural. It's very hard to take the CG generated stuff based on math and make it look organic. At least, I'm not good enough to do that. So I think that's why we also opted for this hand-drawn approach, because it's something that we know, and it's something that's more approachable for us. It's harder to integrate because it doesn't just come from that exact spot where the character meets the water and everything. It has its own set of challenges, but I think in the end, that look, at least for us, helps us achieve what we want better compared to if we did everything just procedurally and all of it in shaders. But to round that whole thing off in terms of the look, I did use a shader for this next part. We have this shimmer right at the very top of the water's edge. Now, the tricky thing with the water for us is that we don't really have perspective in the game, right? Everything is flat, everything is actually 2D. We don't have a 3D camera or anything, so we're faking things with parallax. But for the water, we wanted to introduce a little bit of perspective. And so that's why we lower the player in the water. It's not just sitting at the same level as the rest of the floor and the collisions. It's actually lower in the water. And then at the very top of the water, we just have this subtle evolving noise filter where the little blobs of noise, they merge with other blobs of noise. And I believe it's set to screen or something like that. So it brightens the color a little bit underneath. We decreased the opacity quite a lot, so it's just a very subtle shimmer. I could see this being used in other parts of the world, maybe in brighter parts, where we would increase the shimmer and really have that, not ocean-like shimmer that you would have at the edge of the ocean, right, when you're looking out at the horizon, But, you know, you could play with it, and depending on the scene, we might want something brighter or not there at all. The water, for me, isn't as much about gameplay as it is about a visual element and a way to sort of gatekeep some content. But with that being said, obviously, if you fall in the water, what are you going to do? You're going to have to swim all the way to the ledge to climb up. That would be silly. So what we did, we introduced some platforms. Like, we made a few platforms. We have some static platforms and we have some bouncy platforms. The example that we have right now is just a lily pad. So the lily pad sits on the water. When the player or even an enemy actually hits that platform, it sinks down by a certain amount for a certain amount of time and then bounces back up again. And when the player or an enemy makes contact with that lily pad, we also trigger, again, a hand-drawn animation that just conveys a little bit of movement and the fact that, you know, there was an impact on the platform. So just to round this whole water discussion off, I think the most important part for us is about restraint and the scope. We wanted to keep the scope fairly small. We didn't want to create gameplay that we ourselves don't enjoy. And therefore, no annoying gameplay that's just a chore that you have to go through in order to progress the game. And as for the visuals, I think I can boil it down to don't distort everything, right? Keep reflections minimal, keep the background static, and the silhouettes are the only things that really move, right? Add a little bit of details to those silhouettes. And I think that really helps sell the look of what Ghibli has created.